Всем привет.
Hello, everyone.
Меня зовут
My name
Арсений
is
Жиляев.
Arsenij Zhilyaev,
Я представляю факультет
and I
художественного искусства
represent the
Изевского
Contemporary Art
государственного
Department of
университета.
Sreда, обучения School.
И сегодня мы здесь все собрались по
We have gathered here
особому поводу.
today for a wonderful
Мы
occasion.
инициируем цикл открытых
We
встреч с
initiate
Марией Линд
a
и ее
series of
гостями.
open talks with Maria
Для
Lind
нас
and her
это
guests.
большое событие,
For
прекрасные
us,
новости.
it's a huge event and it's great news,
Это
we believe, and we're happy to share it with you.
достаточно долго мы готовили эти
It's been a long
мероприятия,
time
и
since we started planning.
мы очень рады, что в
And
итоге
we are
проводится
extremely happy that
в
finally we
таком
managed
формате.
to make
Возможно,
these
слушать их
talks
и
open. They will be
по-английски.
open for anyone willing to
Это
join. They will be available in two languages, both
крайне
English
ценно.
and Russian, and I think it's extremely valuable.
Вот. И прежде чем я представлю
Before I introduce
Марию Лин сегодня, я, может быть, добавлю
Marieli, today I will just say a couple of words
от себя. Я,
on
когда
my behalf.
готовился к сегодняшней
When I
встрече,
started getting
помню,
ready for our today's event,
наверное, 12, может быть, даже больше лет назад,
I remember that around 12 or even more years
узнал
ago,
седое обучение.
I
Тогда
got to
это
know
был
Среда, обучения. Back
преподавателем.
then it had a different name.
И
I joined their
практически
team as a tutor, as a teacher,
современного
and
искусства.
back then we didn't have
Но
any contemporary art
был
department at
оффлайн
all,
курс,
but we
связанный с
did have an
курацией.
offline course on
И,
curating art.
так скажем, хедлайнером этого курса
And the
был
headline of
Виктор
that
Мизиано.
course was
На
Victor
сегодняшний день
Miziano.
наш самый
And I think
яркий,
that
заметный, да,
today it's the most
куратор.
prominent and the
И
most
Виктор
active Russian
преподавал
curator worldwide.
курс лекций
Victor gave a
посвященных
series
кураторской
of
профессии.
talks on curating
Доступны
as
на
a
видео.
profession. They're all
Вот,
still available on
пожалуйста.
YouTube. You're most welcome to watch
На
them.
важном для его
This
книги
lecture series became the foundation for his book
«Основах этой профессии».
on the
Сейчас,
foundations
может быть,
of this
это будет
profession.
немножко в новинку.
Back then, it was a kind of a
Среда
novelty.
обучения
It
была
was a
первым
new thing,
изданием,
a new profession. Sreda обучения was in the vanguard
очень важным,
of the
очень
market.
виде до сих
But
пор
after a while, this
пользуется
book
популярностью среди
became a kind of a reference
замечательных
for many contemporary
внимание
curators.
кураторскому мастерству.
And the recorded lectures are still
Сохраняется
available
спустя
and they're
годы,
still
да,
used
они, может быть,
by contemporary young
становятся
curators.
все более и более
Now, many
популярными.
years later, we
И
see that this profession becomes
мы
more and more popular.
делать
It's
встречи
more popular than ever
на
today, I
более
believe. And
экспериментальные
we are very happy to introduce this series
академии
of
для
talks
всего нашего
which
коллектива.
engage
Мы
international
очень
speakers, and
признательны
we will
Марине
experiment with different
за то, что
format.
она
I want
согласилась
to express
работать с
our
нами.
gratitude to Maria for her
Это
joining
будет
our
очень
team, for
важным
her agreeing to collaborate with us on this project. And I hope that this will be an important contribution
в целом.
to the Russian art scene.
И я расскажу немножко о том, чем мы
I will
будем
say a couple
заниматься.
of words about what we are going to do
Сегодня
and
инициируем. И
what
потом передам слово Марии, и она
series of events we initiate today, we launch today. Then I will pass the mic to Maria and she will introduce our today's
запускаем мы
speakers.
два цикла открытых
So
встреч.
we are launching two
Сегодня
series of public
лекция в
talks.
критических зонах, и чуть
Art
позже
and Life in
мы
Critical
начнем
Zones is the one that begins
знакомиться
today, and a bit
с
later we will initiate the series of talks titled Why Curating.
состоящей из художниками,
The
участниками
first
одноименной международной
cycle
которая
of
пройдет
lectures
с
will
23
support
по 12 июня
the exhibition of the
2022
same
года.
name, which will take place in Izevsk from March to June this year. And every talk will be dedicated to two artworks represented in the exhibition. Among the invited artists are artists from Germany, Sweden, Russia, and other countries too. The other series is called White Curating. It will begin on the 22nd of February, and it will be dedicated to different aspects of curating and different practices which Maria took part in since the year 2000. She will share her perspective on contemporary art and why it is relevant and necessary even. Maria will also introduce 5 projects that she participated in, and every event, every talk will be dedicated to one specific topic. Among those are commissioning art, research that curators do, contemporary abstractions, and art as activity and as a profession. You are most welcome to find the schedule of this event on our website. We will share the link in the chat of the player. I also have to say that you're most welcome to choose the language that you want to listen to our today's talk in. You're most welcome to submit your questions too throughout the event. If you are able to submit your questions in English, we will forward them directly to Maria, although I know that Maria speaks Russian and understands Russian perfectly well. But anyway, in English, it will be just faster. Or alternatively, you're also welcome to ask your questions in Russian. We will help with translation. Maria Lind is an international curator and attaché on culture at the Embassy of Sweden, director of Tensta Kunsthalle in Stockholm since 2011 till 2018, and also a person which we collaborated with on numerous projects. And whenever we happen to be in the same city or town, we try to find some time to meet. I really value our collaboration and our communication with Maria, and I'm happy that we have a chance today to listen to her and to talk to her. Now I'm happy to pass the mic to Maria. She will begin our today's event.
It is a total pleasure to start this series, Art and Life in Critical Zones. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Sreda, обучения. And I'm particularly happy that we have made it open and free for all. The purpose of this first series of webinars, Art and Life in Critical Zones, is to delve into some of the art projects that will be shown as part of the exhibition that Arseny mentioned in Izevsk. Excuse me. Oi. At the Art Museum in Izevsk. And I would now like to start my little PowerPoint to give you a bit of a background before we will have a presentation by Ylva Westerlund and Mats Adelman as the first presentation, and then Ivan Novikov as the second presentation, both of which will contribute to the exhibition. So let's see now if I can share my screen. So Izevsk is the capital of Udmurtia. And for those of you who have not yet been, it's a bit west of the Ural Mountains, a population of around 600,000 people. And the heart of the exhibition will be in the building that you see in front of you, which is the Art Museum in Izevsk. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to do this exhibition, thanks to the director, Vera Vakhrusheva, in the museum. Another well-known site in Izevsk, which is an industrial town, is the pond, a huge pond that looks like a lake, but in fact it's man-made. And Arseny, you mentioned that I'm the Counselor of Culture at the Embassy of Sweden. There is actually a Swedish connection to Izevsk. The Nobel family, which was essential in industrializing Russia in the second half of the 19th century, had a big factory here. As you might remember, they were involved with arms production early on, also inventing different types of useful things for the arms industry. Our project will include more venues than the art museum, and it's wonderful that the bookshop Kuzebai will be one of those. In the city center, there is this big, beautiful square which overlooks the pond. And one of the other sites is the fairly newly built Kalashnikov Museum. So the arms industry is present in different ways. This is the hometown of the inventor of this famous weapon. The exhibition itself is composed of primarily existing works by almost 20 artists, some of whom are based in Sweden, others in Russia, and yet others in Finland, Norway, Belgium, and Spain. And I'm particularly glad that we have participants in the exhibition who are based in Izevsk, for instance, Gorod Ustinov, and also some others whom I will mention briefly in a moment. So art and life in critical zones, Alma Heikkilä and her work relates very well to the title. Her work concentrates on the different kinds of life and active agents that participate in her paintings. Paintings which involve fungi, which involve microbiota, and other living organisms that have an effect on the way the paintings develop. Art and life in critical zones borrows the notion of critical zones from Bruno Latour and his circle, a notion that has become more and more common in science to move away from the dichotomy between nature and culture, which has probably contributed significantly to the fact that we are facing a crisis on the planet. And by thinking about a critical zone instead, a zone from the surface of the earth to the end of the atmosphere as a place where all these things coexist and cohabit the particular zone in question. Alma's paintings are often quite large, and the work that we will have in Izevsk is also partly translucent, and typically there would also be objects connected to the paintings, so the painting itself is not its borders are not respected, let's say, but things flow out of the painting. Anastasia Kizilova from Petersburg has drawn inspiration from Charles Darwin and a lesser known side of his research, namely about earthworms. So she, who is based in St. Petersburg, will show a work which involves ceramic containers and living earthworms. Andrei Kostylev is somebody connected to Izevsk. Sadly, he's not with us any longer, but we are going to show a number of his fairly ornamental, detailed drawings with patterns that can be connected to the Udmurt language. He himself had an Udmurt background, so that comes across in many of his works. From Oslo, Apollonia Shusticic will join us. an architect and artist originally from Ljubljana in Slovenia. And for Izevsk, she will continue a project that she started a number of years ago in a city about 200 kilometers north of Stockholm called Gävle. This project focuses on apples and the cultivation of apples. And she has made a social practice type project where she has worked with a local school planting an apple orchard near a newly built sports arena. So something connected to apples will happen in Izevsk. Bernd Kraus, who spends most of his time these days in Brussels, is somebody who is constantly picking up on things around him, found objects, but also materials such as wood. He is fascinated by creativity and constantly transgresses the border between professional creativity as made by artists and the creativity of amateurs. So the aesthetics of amateurs flow into the work, which tends to be a bit like assemblages or makeshift installations. And it's not unusual for him when he's invited to an exhibition to almost move into the institution and to leave traces of his creative activity there. Karin Elberg, based in Stockholm, will show 12 imaginative, colorful watercolors that might resemble what you see in a microscope when you look closely at leaves or tree branches or stones. In fact, they come from observations on beaches, as she has been going on long walks on beaches in the south of Sweden. And in addition to those watercolors, we're hoping to show one of her suspended sculptures, which almost look like enlarged jewelry. Here, just a few more examples of the watercolors. Chudyarjeni, another local artist from Izevsk, we will show a series of videos where he combines his practice as a musician, specifically traditional Udmurt music, with visits to abandoned houses in the countryside of Udmurtia. Together with some friends, he has entered those places and almost activated them through the music that he's playing. And this is documented on video. The life of bees and the keeping of bees is one of the main interests of Erik Sjödin, based in Stockholm. And for Art and Life in Critical Zones, he is looking at the brains of bees. It turns out that the size of a brain bee is actually interesting compared to the size of a human brain, and indicates something about the level of intelligence of these creatures. The sculpture that you see on the picture is actually 3D prints in wood of a bee's brain, and this sculpture will be displayed but in painted form. Here, Fernando Garcia Dori, who is perhaps known as the shepherd artist, since he about 10 years ago started to organize shepherds in various parts of Europe, an endangered profession with a certain role to play in terms of ecology, for instance, but also old habits and techniques of coexisting with the landscape. For Izevsk, he will be contributing boxes that look a bit like suitcases. When you open them, you have a maquette which documents, represents some of his projects that tend to deal with food production, agriculture, existence in the countryside, with notions such as sustainability, agility, resilience, and community as keywords. This oil bird costume is also a sculpture made by Ingela Irman, based in Malmö in the south of Sweden. And as often, she makes her costumes / sculptures herself out of cheap, modest materials and then performs in them. So we're hoping that we can bring this fascinating oil bird sculpture, which includes a little bird baby, to Izevsk, and also that she can make a performance with it. Ivan, your work we will hear more about in a moment. A series of paintings that have been made partly together with, or at least in some kind of cooperation with nature through the place where they were made, but also the material that you have used. But I will leave it to you to talk more about that. Anti-capitalist architecture TV is a project by Joar Nango, who is based in Tromsø in the north of Norway. It's a series of broadcasts where he explores this notion of anti-capitalist architecture. And we're planning to show a number of those episodes. And you might remember that Joar Nango typically thematizes his own Sami background in his work. And this will also be the case with this particular project. Katarina Piiraksippu also draws on her Sami heritage, but from the Swedish side. And the photographs that we will be showing depict specific locations in the north where 100 years ago, the race scientists photographed Sami people. It's a sad and even tragic history in terms of how the Sami people has been treated in the Nordic countries in general, and perhaps in this case specifically in Sweden, where an institute for race science or race biology was established in 1922 at the Uppsala Art Museum. And there people went to the north, asked the Sami people to undress in the landscape because they were nomads. So that's where they found them to photograph them. And then they started to measure them, their skulls, their body, the rest of their bodies, etc. Disgraceful history. And also, sadly, this is something that was then exported to Germany. So the Nazis learned how to do these things in Sweden. Cultivator, how to combine agriculture and art using a far as the starting point. It's a small collective, and they will be showing a series of posters called the Post-Revolutionary Exercises, which were made in the wake of the Arab Spring 10 years ago, thinking about if you have a revolution, what do you do afterwards? Maybe that moment is as important as the revolution itself. So the posters are proposals of what to do after the revolution. Help a farmer, forget money, learn from old people, spread the word, etc. Mats and Ylva, Your work will be specially featured in a moment with watercolors, with wooden sculptures connected to a particular location in the outskirts of Stockholm, the natural reserve Järvafältet, which is also a former military training ground. I will leave it to you to introduce it later. Micro-territory Gorod Ustinov, as I mentioned, Izevsk-based artists, and thank you so much, Kirill and Natasha, for helping out in many different ways with the entire exhibition. And we will hear more about your work in the next webinar next week. But the territory of where you are located in Udmurtia plays a big role in the work, and an interest in scale, what grows and becomes bigger, what can become smaller. And it's also your particular engagement with the neighborhood in a housing block where you live in the outskirts of the city that will come into the exhibition. And how people use the area around the housing block in order to grow vegetables, for instance. Trees, the forest is a main concern of Nina Svensson, who grew up in the middle of Sweden, which is a very foresty area, but who is now based in Stockholm. She will show a series of sculptures that are based on particular trees from particular forests. And in her case, the value of the forest is relevant. Who owns the forest, and how does the forest get its value, and how is the wood from the trees being used? So in fact, her sculptures are made of paper, papier-mâché, which comes, of course, from wood originally. And Sergei Orlov from Izevsk, we will show one of these fantasy-like paintings pointing towards a different future, different creatures in perhaps even a new type of space. And Åsa Sonjasdotter, if Apollonia Szusczyk is dealing with apples, Åsa Sonjasdotter, who lives between Berlin and the island of Ven, is potatoes. And not just any potato, but a particular kind of potato that was developed in East Germany and which happened to become particularly popular in the Soviet Union because it's a sturdy potato that can withstand different climatic conditions. And this is a research-based project which is presented as photographs, as a video, as printed matter, etc. And if things go well, we hope that the visitors to the exhibition will also be able to take one of the Andretta potatoes and plant them in their own plantation. This was the end of my little introduction. I hope that those of you who are with us today would like to join us also for the following webinars, and eventually maybe some of you will come to Izevsk for the exhibition. The duration is 2.5 months, and we're planning events around the time of the opening, and who knows, maybe some other things during the exhibition as well. And I am now super glad to have Ylva and Mats start the presentation. And for me, it's always important to to keep a keen eye on the artworks themselves, to give time to artworks, to look at them, to discuss them, preferably together with others, with groups of people. And I think this series gives us the opportunity to pay attention to what, at least for me, is the reason for working with curating, namely the artworks and the way art today can really help us grapple with existence the way it is. So Mats and Ylva, you live in Tensta, a suburb of Stockholm, and you work a lot in relation to an area next to Tensta. Your background in terms of education is in the south of Sweden. You went to art school in Malmö, which many people consider one of the most interesting art educations in the Nordic region. And you work both individually and together. And what you will be talking about now is a joint project. And it's also a joint project that you will show quite soon here in Moscow, opening on the 10th of February at the Moscow Museum of Modern Art in the Education Center. And that will be the beginning of a series of solo presentations of artists based in Sweden. But now, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria, for the introduction. And maybe you just told, you know, what we are going to be telling, but we will do it anyway. No, but it's really nice to be here. So we will just start our sharing the screen. I hope I do it in the right way. Okay, so
it was a bit not in the start.
Sorry, I will soon be doing the right thing.
No.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, and thank you for inviting us. My name is Mats Adelman, and this is Ylva Westerlund. And we are artists living in Stockholm. And we are both working in different medias as drawing, painting, sculptures, and installation. We have separate practices, but often collaborate in works connected to ideas on the relation between city-close nature and dreaming. And we are exploring different landscapes with first-hand observations like field excursion and bird watching. Since many years, we're both interested in bird watching, and it's a way to getting you into odd places as harbors, wetlands, or city wastelands, places that may be considered has a low value as romantic wilderness, but often rich in wildlife. Mm-hmm.
So, for example, as we are bird watchers, we kind of have recognized that there is a bigger chance of seeing a diverse variety of bird species close to, for example, cities. And this is partly because there is a big or like a long history of industrial use of the woods of Sweden. So the flora and fauna there is actually diminishing, while the flora around cities are can harbor quite unusual species and quite an amount of them too. So these kind of landscapes are something that we are looking for, and they have a kind of hidden value also relating to societal or industrial goals, since they have become a kind of a blind spot in modernity almost, that it has a Lack of use, it's considered almost as a wasteland. So in that sense, it kind of has been spared to the development that has been going on in rest of the city or society. Connected maybe to the use of natural assets, and these places maybe are not that easy to see the assets in. We are also interested in these spaces since they are kind of establishing another space that is a little bit freer. Since the goals are lost, you could kind of grasp for other goals. Maybe we also try to use these kind of spaces for imagining possibilities for the future. So we are going to show.
Yes, we are going to show our work. Only Birds Shall Fly and the Military Rust, which is based on the experience of a walk in a deserted military ground. This is an installation which has never been shown before. So this work will be shown as work in progress pictures from our studio. Our studio is placed in the Järva field, which is a nature reserve near Stockholm suburb Tensta. The nature area is surrounded by housing areas and highways.
And it also used to be this former military area, which is also, it bears traces of with abandoned bunkers and so on.
And the picture shows 10 watercolor paintings on the wall and 8 sculptures made of wood placed on the floor and the wall.
And here you can see some of the watercolors hanging on the wall. They are about A3 or like 30 centimeters by 40 centimeters. And you could also see a sculpture in the lower part of the picture, which is made in concrete and wood. And it's a lark. No, it's a meadow pipit, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, and here we have 3 of the birds placed on the wall. And the little one in the left corner is a firecrest, a small bird. And in the middle is a hawfinch. And under the watercolor painting, it's a blackbird. And they are connected to carved branches that are formed like whirl sculptures or some fluid motions or something.
Almost like air or something, gas fluids or something. There's also a picture of a watercolor in the background with text. So this watercolor is a text, and it's depicting it lying on like withered grass and leaves. And it's kind of could be described as a field note, and it describes a situation during a walk or an excursion we made in another former military ground in March 2020. Because of the lockdown in air traffic during the spread of the coronavirus, we experienced an unusual silence during this walk. Otherwise, it used to be airplanes flying over almost constantly. And now the details of the landscape seemed more clear, and one could sense other things and hear the sounds of other beings. It was almost like a precognition. And I will read an excerpt from the text that you are watching. When the first rays of sun colored the clouds, the activity intensified among the birds. A few loud yaffles from a green woodpecker, then a blackbird flew up with a warning call. On the ground, a small group of skylarks, woodlarks, and meadow pipits. Further down the road, by the tall beech tree, a hawfinch flew by. Then light grew stronger over the fields, and a group of motorized vehicles became visible.
Yes, and here we see sculptures of the birds, some of the birds, and it's wood lark, two skylarks, and one meadow pipit, and they are made of wood and placed on. They are natural size, and they are placed on a concrete piece of concrete that is casted directly on the ground on the Järva field, so you can see traces from leaves and grass. But this concrete piece will not be part of the exhibition. They will be placed in another way there.
But on the floor.
On the floor, yes. Yes. Yes, and I when I do the birds, I go from branches or pieces of wood that I find, and I work with quite simple tools like axe and knives, and I produce a lot of wood chips that spreads in the studio, and it's quite annoying. And then I paint them with a watercolor, and this is the hawfinch. Yes. Here is another bird included in the installation, and it's a falcon. In the English, it's called merlin.
It's quite small.
Yeah, it's the smallest bird of prey in Europe, and you can see it during winter, spring, and autumn in Stockholm part of Sweden. Otherwise, it's more northern. Yes, here is another. It's the same bird, the merlin. Yes.
The installation also includes some studies of rust, which are shown in this picture a bit after the picture with the text. And the rust was experienced by us while walking in this area. And I will show you some more of those. So you see, this is one of them. And it's a kind of a study of the how the metal on these vehicles are getting more and more rusty, and it's some kind of paint that flakes away. And here is another one, which is more, when you see there is only small bits of paint left, and it's also these bullet holes, which are starting to grow due to the rust eating away. Here is another one when you can see the layers of the different kind of paints that are starting to lift off. And I will continue to read from our field note that was connected to these studies of rust. By a closer inspection of the bodywork, one can see that the paint and metal directly affected by sun and wind had turned pale, fragile, and flaky. Tall grass and herbs in the immediate surrounding made the objects dry and dusty. Some other deserted vehicles were spotted under the oak trees. The specific biotope created a microclimate where moss and lichens just about managed to cover the underlying metal structures, a process close to something that could be described as biological decay. This is also showing is a watercolor that shows glass that has been cracked and it's started to wither away, this kind of protective film, and also the rust in the frame around it.
Yes, when we looked at this scenery, we started to think about it almost as a science fiction scenario in which the vehicles almost by themselves had turned into a kind of environmentally adapted machines, not distinguishing themselves anymore from the surrounding vegetation.
And in the field note, we explain it like this. Watching the rust on military objects falling apart, a vision slowly emerged. The possibility for an environmentally adapted army service, ammunition made biodegradable, bandwagons fueled by mobile enclosed hot compost units. And maybe then the whole purpose and aim for these machines would be redirected. So this is also watercolor, showing also the flakes and also some kind of traces of the former use for it. And here is the installation again. The intention of this work is to recreate or resurrect a moment in March 2020. And by showing our installation at the exhibition Art and Life in the Critical Zone, it is transferred to a different geographical place, but with a shared biosphere. By studying maps or, for example, bird population or bird breeding, you can find that the inland bird fauna of Sweden has many similarities to the bird fauna of Izevsk and Udmurtia. And this shows patterns of migration routes and also the transgressing of borders that connects these local ecologies to each other. So this is kind of what we wanted to show on our work. And maybe we were fast, maybe we can discuss it a bit more in depth, but I will stop sharing, right? Should I stop sharing the screen?
Maybe it can stay.
It can stay, okay. So
yes.
We can go back and forth if you want to see something again, so.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ylva and Mats. We now have a moment for immediate questions like fact questions or detailed questions. And for those of you who cannot speak directly, please use the chat for those direct questions. And more overarching questions we will keep for the end after Ivan's presentation. I'm interested in the use of, let's say, realism and even photorealism in your work, but that's a question for later that you can think about. Ivan and the rest of the audience, do you have direct questions?
Вот у меня есть небольшой.
I have a brief question about the watercolor with the text. If I understood correctly, it is a collage, a combination. You had a close-up of it, and it looks like you put these burnt leaves on it. It's like a collage, and it is cubist in a way with diagonals. And unlike all the other watercolors, it is not a study, a pure study, but is a more complex work. Could you tell a bit more about it? Why did you compose it this way? Why is it built this way?
Yes. Oh, thank you for your question, Ivan. Yes, it actually quite different from the other ones. It is a way of showing this kind of field note, which was a part of a kind of the earliest stages of doing this work together. So it kind of bring these two experiences with the birds, but also with the decaying or rusting vehicles together. So it's also, yeah, as you say, it's a patchwork or something. So if you turn it over, it looks like someone you know, has been to the hospital and you have to patch them up with lots of tape. So, and it's also charred edges that has been burned in the edges. So it has some kind of more of an object in itself, that it bears traces, or it's a patchwork. So yeah, do you have anything?
No, I don't know.
But is it, sorry, but is it a collage?
Yes, it is.
No, it's I mean, everything is in watercolor. I mean, it's handwritten, but it has been, you know, cut in and then patched up again and burnt in, and so it is a kind of a process or something in it that it's.
And was it one image first, and then you cut that up and you pasted together exactly that image?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was going away and then it came back in this shape.
Interesting.
Mm.
Did that answer your question, Ivan?
Да.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot, because it was something that intrigued me, even technically, how you made this. It is so painstaking work, and it fits so nice together. But thank you, you answered my question.
And to our translators, do we have any other questions?
We have a question in English. Why do you use watercolor but not photography of different fragments and pieces of rust?
Yeah. Vill du ta fram dem? Yeah, I was thinking, actually, I've been working a lot with watercolors, thinking about the water as a way of describing the processes, or for example, rust, or you know, in wetlands, or I've been depicting also that in watercolor. So in a way, I wanted to use the ways of rust or something also in the ways of describing this experience. So something in, I mean, photography is also you know, capturing something, but I wanted also to be in the process of water and color, or changing, or yeah. So that's why I kind of wanted to choose this material, which kind of reflects this process, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that's that makes sense conceptually, so to speak. Dear translators, I cannot see any question in the chat. Can you please confirm?
There is only one question which I have already. There is only one question as far as I can see, and maybe the moderator can have something more, but there are no other questions in the chat. There are no other questions in the chat. Please turn on English, Maria.
Okay, let's move on to Ivan, and water, and thinking about the binding agent in painting is something that plays a certain role for you as well, Ivan. And it is funny that actually you have met Ivan, Ylva, and Mats. I did not know this when I invited you to the show. I did not know this when I proposed that you would be the first two artist positions in this series, but in fact, an exhibition that Oksana Polyakova and some other people were involved with at the Center Krasny a few years ago. That's where your paths crossed last time. So Ivan, now the screen is all yours, and let's see if we can get you to be the main person.
Так, сейчас тогда начну делиться экраном. Одну секундочку, запущу это.
And you, Ivan, based in Moscow, and comes out of a painting practice, having studied painting also in Moscow, and you have taken it in a different direction than Ylva in the watercolors, but I found several fascinating parallels now hearing Mats and Ylva talk about the Izevsk project. And in your case, your work has taken you to other geographies, to Southeast Asia, for instance. And the works that we're discussing for Izevsk, they are at the same time bound to your own garden.
Да.
That's true. Can you see my screen? Does it work?
Yes.
Ага. Да, Мария, вы абсолютно правы.
Yes, Maria, you're absolutely right. Actually, I wanted to say first that it's real magic. We have already met with Ylva and Mats. Actually, I was absolutely sure that that was your plan as a curator to put us together, to arrange this meeting after a few years.
Поэтому очень действительно приятная и неожиданная получилась встреча.
And I'm very happy to see you all. This is a very pleasant meeting for me indeed. Now let me share a couple of words about my art, about my work. The first thing to say is, actually, this is what Maria has already put into words very rightly. I turn to water, to liquids in my works. Over the past few years, I've been doing quite a large-scale project in which I use rainwater, the water that comes from the environment, from nature, in my art practice. Mostly I use rainwater in painting, but also in sculpture sometimes. It is very important for me to use the water that I collect myself with basins, with cups in my dacha, in my cottage house. Normally, I let the water drop on the canvases that I paint. I set the canvases at the fence of my summer house, and when the rain starts, I let it pour all over the canvas. Today I will share a few of the works which I created in the framework of this rainwater project. It's called Against Grain. And first I want to explain why the motif of rainwater interests me so much. If we look at the history of using color and pigments in the history of painting and history of culture, we will see that mostly the materials used are natural, are taken from nature. If we take painting, for example, for many centuries, natural pigments were used, oil was used, organic pigments, water, linen, wood, and other natural materials. In the 20th century, we acquired a unique possibility of working with synthetic materials. For many years, in my practice, I use tempera, which is a natural material, which I loved a lot. I loved it. I love to use tempera on linen canvases. So basically, my works were 100% organic. But more and more, I became interested in synthetic materials, synthetic canvases, and at some point, I started to use acrylic paints. I wanted to understand what this material is and what it means in the contemporary cultural space. And in these years of my experiments with acrylic paints, I understood that something I was missing in my work was the following. I actually love the material. It's beautiful, it's very subtle, but this material created works of art which are completely withdrawn from the natural cycles. At some point, I started working with synthetic canvases, canvases which are made with different kinds of synthetic fabrics. I also used all kinds of natural materials. I used natural pigments, which I produced myself, and I used moss. And at some point, I started to pay particular attention to the water I use. And I realized that my technique of painting has a lot to do with water, with my use of water. In my practice, some years ago, I used to apply a few layers of color, and a couple of years ago, or maybe even more, that was before COVID pandemic. I think it was somewhere in 2017 actually. So I started to experiment with canvases. I just let them stand by the fence in my summer house and let them out there. Let the rain pour over. Let all natural elements influence the canvas. At some point, Andrei Yegorov and Anna Eginan invited me to the Moscow Museum of Modern Art to make a project, and I decided to focus on this technique when I interact with liquids. I wanted to make it full scale, to turn it into a real project, which I had been dreaming about for quite a time. I made 5 canvases. Actually, I have a slideshow here. These are the same canvases with close-ups or with bigger views. You can see that the canvases are almost monochrome. And they are the result of this project of mine where I interacted with water a lot. For quite a long time, I was interested in the history of art, history of culture, public history, and at some point I read the book Against Grain by an American anthropologist. This is an academic publication, of course, with a huge bibliography, but still, he used it all to show that the interaction of a human being with grains, all kinds of grains, actually changed our culture and how we watch. How we perceive culture, nature, how the vertical gaze, the horizontal gaze emerges. When we take on ourselves unusual perspectives, perspectives of the state, when our gaze is very general, when we don't look at the details, actually his work is very serious, very academic. It shocked me. It influenced me a lot because it described different kinds of looking, also looking at works of art. One of my hobbies, one of my biggest interests is working with monochrome paintings, although my background is academic painting. I studied at the Surikov Institute, which offers quite a traditional training. Actually, these techniques, the techniques I was taught, were borrowed or inherited from the social realism. I started to think, how can we show history with painting, not through narratives, not through showing objects, but through different techniques and tools, and in particular, monochrome painting, or almost monochrome. And when a viewer sees monochrome paintings, for many viewers, this is not of special interest. So they get the idea and they just pass on. But if they take on a different kind of gaze, a different kind of looking, they will see all kinds of details. And this concerns not just my works, not just my pieces, but all artworks in the history of art. This is the goal I set. I wanted to work with non-figurative painting. I was inspired with Thomas Cole, an American painter who painted in the style of Romanticism. He is the founder of landscape painting, American landscape painting. I would say that he's one of the founding fathers of the school of the classical American landscape painting. He painted this cycle, The Path of the Empire, which consists of 5 landscapes, 5 canvases. One can read them from left to right. Their aim was to figuratively show a generalized image of history. One of the key points was that in the works of Thomas Cole, it all centers around important eras in the history of humanity, including the paradise in the overhand left corner, pure nature, then we see the first shepherds, we see agriculture being born. Then the civilization emerges. You see that it's all in white and yellow tones. Then the empire, the civilization crushes. We can see volcanoes erupting. We can see armies intruding this peaceful landscape. And then the nature takes over again. So the figure of a human being here is that of pushing away nature, but just for a while. I wanted to add nature to all layers of painting. In today's contemporary art, contemporary painting, we very rarely see natural materials used for purely technical reasons, of course, because acrylic paints, for example, are much easier to use. So I started to make these canvases in plein air. They're quite big, all of them, around 2 meters each. And if you look closely, you will see that there are a lot of vertical lines here. You can see here the traces of my brush, which applies glazing, a lot of layers, around 60, 70 layers for every painting. And then I left these paintings, these canvases, in the open air, and the rain blurred the layers. There is a pine tree not far from my house. There are other trees, birch trees, and poplar trees, and the drops of rain that came from them, from the leaves of these trees, added another kind of agency, natural agency, to my paintings. And if you look at them as a whole, you will see that these paintings reproduce the colors and the tones of Thomas Cole in his cycle, The Path of the Empire. For me, Of course, the initial idea was not to make a color copy of an academic painting. That was not my intention. It was a kind of an homage to his ideas, to his paintings. And I wanted to work with this idea that just with the paint, we can show how the natural and the cultural, the artful are intertwined. We can see that these connections, these overlappings are problematic, and conceptually, they pose both ethical and social problems. We can't divide culture and nature harshly. So this is why these amazing landscapes by Thomas Cole became a kind of a starting point for me. Is it possible at all today to work with the natural elements, moisture, morning dew, rainwater? Is it possible at all to juxtapose nature and culture today?
И я попытался в этой
In
серии
my view, we cannot talk about this dichotomy anymore. In this series, I wanted to show that natural events are co-authors of the artist. The canvas are covered by acrylic paint with a lot of acrylic within the canvas and within the ground as well. But this material substance of the creative production that is, of course, important throughout the history of painting and art in general, it becomes, for me, a tool. This material substance becomes a tool through which the viewer can analyze their experience of art and painting. When you come to the exhibition, when viewers came to the exhibition, if they just came on a whim, they saw that this is just a monochrome painting, and they skipped it and went to another hall with video art and objects and so on. But only if you start looking at it thoroughly, looking into the painting, you realize that beyond this top layer of paint, there is, however remote, the same composition as in Thomas Cole's paintings. And if you look thoroughly, although you cannot do it through a photo reproduction that you see here, it was important for me for the camera to concentrate this depth, because cameras look only at the surface. It cannot look into deeper layers if a lot of glazing has been applied. But the viewer who came to experience this art live, they looked into the painting and saw the same compositional elements as in Thomas Cole's paintings. And if you look at this work live, you will see the columns, the volcano, all buried under the layers of paint that altogether creates the color solution of each painting. For
и
example, this one
удивительным
with
образом в
volcano,
ней видите
and
такое светлое пятно
surprisingly, you
слева.
see this
Это как раз
lighter
место, с
patch
которого
to the left of the center.
почему-то в какой-то
It
момент
is the patch where at one moment a lot of water was spilled from the top of the fir tree, of the pine tree, and the canvas became enlarged. And when I applied paint later, I almost completely destroyed the initial layer. This was a direct interaction with nature, and it was the same patch on the painting that also had a lighter splash of light in Cole's original work. And so the visitor will read the explanatory text, or maybe read a lot of books that had to do with the subject. I had a whole bibliography. I put the actual books in the hall, in the exhibition hall. These were books that I believe were important to understand this whole set of issues I work with. And so the viewer was able to start recognizing these flashbacks within the painting, because their gaze is also affected by complex historical processes, be it the discovery of farming and of cereals, which brings us to a broader perspective, for example, as Scott calls us, the perspective of a state. It is the gaze, the perspective that does not allow us to look into the phenomenon. Only when you have read this, or you have heard it from the curator or from myself, then as a viewer, you start noticing that you are looking at the painting in the same way as it is described in contemporary anthropological theory. You are skimming the painting. Only when you look at it in detail, interact with the nature's glazing, you will realize that there are many more layers within. You are not skimming anymore. And finally, it was important for me, not just for these paintings, but also for the whole project. When I was working with rainwater, it was important to show this breakdown of various modes of looking. If you use ordinary water, especially in places like Moscow, it might be different in other regions. For example, in Vladivostok, they have different salts dissolved in water. And when I worked with their water, it was different. But if you use just ordinary tap water, it works in a different way. It doesn't bring about this effect of looking into the painting. It is different salts, chlorine, and so on. Rainwater is something else. It has this strange capability of creating space, creating large layers of glazing within the painting. I think this is what I wanted to say, and that's it from me for today.
Thank you so much, Ivan. Very interesting. I was wondering if you maybe had one more slide of the smaller paintings also, or maybe you want to just comment briefly about the smaller paintings that were part of my previous presentation.
Да.
Yes.
В том числе те слайды,
the slides that you showed, they were also part of this bigger project in which I work with rainwater. It was a sub-series called The Two Ends, because as I work with monochrome painting, I often make series of paintings with one name, and within the series each work has just a number. And the smaller paintings that Maria had on her slides, they were made in a way that was even closer to nature. I mean that due to their size, I was able to staple them directly on a fence. And my fence is different in different places. In some places it's straight, in some places it's leaning slightly, but anyway, they were exposed to the outdoor air, and they were created through the work of rainwater. And of course, I used rainwater to make the paints as well. And technically, they are one single project created using one kind of a technical regime or blueprint, which I create for myself. In the bigger paintings, we have one difference from these smaller paintings, that I was leaning these bigger paintings against the fence, so they were hanging at a different angle. But technically, it's the same way of working with rain, the same technique of working with water. And what's interesting and important is that in these smaller paintings, the viewer can come closer to them and
Я прошу прощения, просто открыл чат.
I've opened the chat and seen some questions that I've lost the thought for a while. So the viewer was able to come closer to the painting, and they were less able to see the depth, but the vertical traces of rain were more pronounced. On a smaller painting, this looks more prominent. It immerses the viewer more.
Yes, maybe you would like to respond to the question from Irina in the chat.
Да.
Do you want maybe to read the question and then reply?
Ну, я так понимаю, это
So,
обращен ко мне.
the question is to me. Ivan, have you located the references that inspired you somewhere where they are visible to the viewer? Well, in fact, I didn't locate any visual reference, any of these Thomas Cole paintings, anywhere in the exhibition hall. I deliberately avoided showing them so that there is no direct comparison of the works that inspired me, this cycle, and my paintings. Because one shouldn't be presuming and comparing oneself with a greater painter. But anyway, in the explication text, I always mention that this is a homage to Thomas Cole, and the viewers straight away Googled these paintings to look at them.
Perhaps you have a question for Ivan?
Did you ask us, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I loved seeing your paintings. They are so amazing, and they are kind of also this way that you're describing this, the viewer or the way of sharpening senses when you engage them, or I mean, either you sharpen your senses or you kind of do not see them in a way, or see the layers. So I think it's really interesting. But I was also interested in asking you about how long do you leave them outside, and also do you get other traces? I mean, do you get like, you know, small, you know, stones from space on them, or do you get like birds walking on them, or shit or something like that?
Да, спасибо.
Yes, thank you for this question. This is a secret aspect of these works in a way, because in fact, yes, bird droppings is something that often comes onto the paintings from above, but I found a location where there are branches of firs and pine trees above the fence, and birds do not sit there due to the needles of the tree, but they seem to have flown by and sat on my canvases because I saw some traces. The canvases are kept outside for the whole time of their creation. I did not have any studio at the time, and so all the canvases within this multi-year project, I paint in the warm season from like April or May to September. I paint outdoors and when it's not freezing. And what's most important, I let them stay outside during the whole time of working on the project. For example, this particular painting that you are seeing now, all in all, it was outside for 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks of its creation, and then a little bit more. So all in all, it might be even a month. And considering the fact that I was often painting not from dawn to dusk, but with pauses, because different weather, different humidity, and as a result, I was not able to paint on humid or completely wet canvas after a rain. It was not possible to apply the next layer without destroying the previous layer. That's why working hours were different day by day. But all in all, I think it's 2 to 3 weeks to create each painting. And during this time, different traces appeared. For example, this red one, I didn't see what actually happened, but as far as I remember, there was a light drizzle, and after it, I saw this very wet trace on it. Maybe something fell on the canvas, a branch, a bird, although less likely a bird. And so this strong trace was there. But bird droppings sometimes turned out in unexpected places. It might not be very visible here on the photo, but in this white painting, I let them stay, these whitish droppings, as a kind of an Easter egg, a hidden joke, a hidden element. Because in the other works, remains of bird droppings were easy to remove next day. They were not adhering to the paint.
Thank you, Ivan. I find it very interesting that both bodies of work that we have discussed tonight ask from me as a viewer to sharpen my gaze, as you said, Ylva, but in such different ways. So I will ask a couple of questions now, and then I want to open up to anyone for smaller and bigger questions. And the first question is to both of you, namely, if the viewer is so important in terms of paying attention, perception, focus, etc., can you talk a little bit more about the viewer? Because the absence of the viewer, of people looking at your works or engaging with your works, is so palpable in the documentation. None of you have a person there. So it's as if it's a void in a way, which is the most common way of documenting art. And it's still a little bit puzzling to me that it is like that. But anyway, so that's my question. Can you elaborate on the position of the viewer and this idea of a sharpened gaze somehow? And then the other question is what I mentioned to you before, Ylva and Mats, and that is the use of realism or even photorealism in your work.
Okay. I think in the birds, I have two hang-ups. And the first is to make it natural, scientific, right? And the other one is to make it some kind of handcraft. So it looks homemade, almost like a punk aesthetic. So in the birds or in many of the sculptures, I do combine those elements because as a bird watcher, I'm interested in to make them look the right way. And I'm also mostly interested in the back and the wings, the patterns of the feathers. That is very hypnotic in many of the birds, often the more brown, gray, camouflage colored. And I'm also interested in the position of the bird and that it should look alive. And at the same time, if you look close to them, they are quite rough made. You can see cracks and joints, and you also see the wood through the color because it's watercolor. and it's not like white paint first. So you can see the wood structure or the what's the name? Wood. Yeah, the elements of wood through the paints. What about what did you say? The realism. Yes, it should be. They should look alive, like they are alive in the position and in the patterns of the feathers, but still like homemade objects. And I cannot really explain why I want it. It's more like how it became.
I also think that it has some kind of relevance as we start off with a situation, which is like with our bird watching excursions, that it is, and also with the field notes, that we are trying to, as close as possible, describe a moment which is in a way connected to, you first have to describe it, and then we kind of tries to find cracks in it, like for example in time or traces of other stories or something like that. So for my case, for example, with the rust studies, I also used to work with comics and so on. So I have this kind of way of also describing things in series to describe time, but also as kind of a narration. And so I think that is a bit like a starting point for dissolving time or cracking up narratives and so on. So that's maybe, yeah, the way. And also, maybe it was something about the loss of a viewer or something like that. And maybe, yeah, of course, I think that it's a part of the work, actually, this kind of almost like left spaces or a vision where humans are not really like the main process or main viewer, or a perspective that could challenge a kind of Anthropocene ways. So
yeah, we are always doing the works without thinking about an exhibition often.
Yeah.
So we do them for ourselves in the first hand.
That's a good point. Ivan, what are your thoughts about the viewer, if you can elaborate on that?
Да, ну, для меня, на самом деле, это очень важный аспект.
Yes, for me, it's an extremely important aspect indeed. Because whenever I work, not only in the recent years, but also before, I always try to think about my projects as entities that will function in the physical space, the cultural space, the social space. It's my personal obsession, probably, but I always think about the viewer and how the viewers are going to see or to look at the painting. And I completely agree with what Ilva and Mats have just said. When I create works, I don't create them only for human beings. So they are not anthropocentric 100%. It's not for the audience, or rather the audience doesn't have to be humans. It's a conventionality to a certain extent, of course, but even in my earlier works, I made pieces for plants. So I made pieces, the installations, the audience of which were plants. So I made paintings and color drops perceivable for different plants. I used all sorts of plants, especially those that influence colors. The sycamore fig, which I love, ficus trees. It is known in science that they react to the colors around them. They grow closer to warmer colors, and they try to stay farther from the colder colors. At some point, I started to see it as my goal that whenever I make a project, I make it for as diverse audience as possible, for animals, cats, rats, dogs, as well as humans. And it's important for me how they see these works. In documentation, anyway, this will work completely different. So when a photographer is invited to take photos of my works, because I can't do that good enough, I always ask to shoot my works without people, without any additional objects, for the installation to look as a completely neutral space documented by kind of a cyber gaze, programmed gaze. And even the photos that I showed today, I think this could be photoshopped, actually. This could be a collage made in Photoshop. It's very easy to reproduce with the digital tools we all have. So I may have as well lied to you. Maybe the exhibition has never been there.
Kind of a curatorial approach, because it's almost impossible for me to think about the presentation of art without it being situated with people. Being situated means also that it becomes public, it is shared with other people. So in a way, I love documentation which is taken when the institution is open, so that you have actually the usual visitors in the space. But anyway, this is a side question. With both of you, I have a feeling that the work is looking back at me. I am looking and I'm asked to really pay special attention. And simultaneously, the work is observing me. With this being said, I see that there is a question for you, Ivan, in the chat. If you can take a look at it, and we will look forward to your answer and see if there will be more questions coming up.
Да, вопрос к
Yeah,
Ивану.
sure. So here is the question. What do you think if you work at winter when the water freezes? Could it contribute to the textures of your paintings? Thank you very much for the question. Actually, at some point of time, I started experimenting with it. But I already said that I work with glazing, with extremely thin layers of paint, which I dissolve with water. This would be impossible to do in winter because this thin layer of paint will freeze immediately. There will be no adhesion with the canvas. So I mean, physically, this would be impossible. I tried doing that with oil paints in winter, and I made a discovery that actually at -25 it is possible.
Не использовать только белую краску, потому что титановые белила ниже 10
Or even at
градусов.
-30, the only color you can't use is white, because the white color turns into a kind of a texture of cottage cheese. All others, ochre, cobalt, and others, they work perfectly well. And when I made my winter studies, I worked at extremely low temperatures, and the colors worked perfectly well. The adhesion was great, but the white color is a no-go because it turns into a curd. But how can you avoid the white color if you work in the Russian winter? So it created kind of color issues for me when I worked at that.
We have about 10 more minutes, and I'm curious if there are more questions or comments from the participants who are not the speakers, but also if the speakers have more to say to each other.
Yeah, I don't know if I missed anything, Ivan, but when you're painting thin layers, and then or do you paint something, or just in layers?
But on top of it.
On the top of it, and it's different colors, so you have to paint one layer, and then you take it in to dry, and then you put it out again. Did you understand? Yes.
Ну, технически я...
Technically, I create them all completely outdoors without bringing them in. Until they're ready, I don't bring them inside. But I work in such a way that the first layers are more transparent with dyes, with paints that don't cover all the canvas with their dye, paintings that are really transparent. Sienna, natural ochre, umbra, and other paints based on minerals, on earths, as they call them. They allow to create a transparent, thin layer, which is nevertheless quite bright and colorful. And in this layer, I use the same composition. I recreate the composition of the existing painting, or create just a general layer, an imprimatur that sets the color palette for the remaining layers. Next, the following layers use different colors, and each layer has a different color than the previous one. I usually don't use pure tones, but rather some more complex mixtures. I create mixed hues, but as a result, it's always more or less monochrome after the final layers, because the canvas at a certain point just stops holding the pigment.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the clarification. There is another question for you, Ivan, in the chat.
Вопрос в чате, вопрос к Ивану.
So the question is whether canvas are destroyed in time, with time, if you are painting under rain. The linen canvas that is used in traditional painting is not destroyed by water at all. Maybe they don't do like this in Sweden, but in Russia, we still use linen thread to waterproof plumbing, because linen threads do not get destroyed by water. They can expand and contract, but they can stay in contact with water for centuries. The linen canvas is very elastic, but there is a drawback, because the ground layer and the gluten expands too much and cracks appear, so that paint starts flaking off. That's why I use mixed canvas, which includes linen, cotton, and acrylic threads, because these fibers, like acrylic, don't expand that much. Neither acrylic nor cotton don't expand as much as linen. And that's why the paint layer and the ground do not get obliterated by water. It's a very fine detail, but I don't recommend to use gelatinous grounds if you work with water, because gelatin creates very brittle surfaces. And in Soviet times, many grounds were made with gelatin. So if you use these old canvases and maybe newer Russian canvases, water will create cracks or the canvas will lose its shape. Sorry for these technicalities.
Detailed discussions about how to do things, because I do believe that the question of how art is being made is crucial today. It's not only in general from the micro level to macro level about what we do, but it is how we do it. That is the key question of our time even. And I think it bears on art making as well. So thank you for all these details. It's valuable. And there are two more questions for you, Ivan, in the chat, and then I should reply to some questions also, and then it's time to wrap up.
So the questions are, is the surface of the canvas disturbed by rain? It's a question of preservation. And do you lacquer your works? And the second question is, what was first, the idea of drawing and painting under rain, or the general concept of co-authoring with nature? I'll start with the technical question. I do not lacquer my works specifically for their preservation, because lacquer creates an polymeric layer on top of the paint, and the paint stops breathing, so to say. And for oil paints and acrylic, this is beneficial, that the canvas is not breathing. But in my case, when I work with thin layers of glazing, it's important for the painting to breathe, because I use wooden frames. Of course, many people in Germany, for example, use frames of metal, like Richter. He paints using metal frames, but I use wooden frames. That's why for me it's important that the painting breathes, and it's possible only if I do not lacquer it, if I don't varnish it. And if you use the technique that I have described, the painting will be preserved for a long time. And this took a lot of experiments. For 10 years, I've been experimenting with various techniques, and that's the conclusion that I have. And the second question, what came first, painting under rain or the general idea of co-authorship with nature? I can answer like this. I'm really interested in the history of painting, and I saw that in the past, painting was always connected to its natural context. Very often, it was just a frame that people were ignoring. It was something on the margin. And about 10 years ago, I tried to co-author with nature in various ways. I used various techniques, and only in the recent period, the last 5 years, I started literally painting outdoors and leaving the paintings to live for a while outdoors. Before that, I used to bring them in as soon as I had finished. But what came first was the general idea of co-authorship with nature.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions. So I was asked if I'm familiar with the cultural heritage of the Finno-Ugric peoples in Izevsk and Udmurtia, for instance, and the ethnofuturism that has been developed. Yes, I am, and I think it's super interesting. And I hope that it somehow will play into the project through the artworks. It might be worth mentioning that often when I curate something, it is rather the artworks themselves that talk about particular topics or theoretical connections. I might have some thoughts also, but it's essentially something that is already there, more or less openly, more or less latently in the artworks. So the answer to that question is yes. And the other question is if I have, what are the peculiarities of working in Russia, and have I curated things in Russia before? And I haven't thought about this before, but actually I did curate a small exhibition at what was called the Museum of Revolution in Petersburg in the early 90s, before it became the Museum of History in Kshetinskaya's palace, the magnificent Art Nouveau Jugend villa. And that was so long ago, it was a different world, it seems. And since I came to Moscow in August of 2022 to work at the Embassy of Sweden, I have worked with a couple of smaller exhibitions connected to children's literature. And one of them has also traveled to children's libraries in Nizhny Novgorod and in Murmansk. And I think there are peculiarities with working in Russia, just as there are peculiarities working in Sweden or Norway or South Korea or Romania or wherever. It's maybe a little bit early to paint this picture of difference in large strokes. But one thing which is true, I believe, or at least I should say is my experience, in terms of working in Russia compared to Sweden, and it's not only curating or art, it's that the planning process is different. Maybe Sweden is a bit over-planned. Many people are obsessed with having a plan, having it long in advance, etc. Whereas in Russia, there is another openness to improvisation, ad hoc solutions, maybe waiting closer to the actual event before things start moving, if I generalize in both cases. Now let's see, I just will check the chat if we have anything else. Oh yes, we have a question for Mats and Ylva. How do other people, neighbors of Mats and Ylva, behave in the territory of the reserve? And then we can make this the last question.
Yeah, I guess we could answer that question as we have our studio in a nature reserve, yes, and it's close to 5 different suburbs, I think, in Stockholm. So it's a lot of housing areas and big highways, and I mean, there is these qualities that we are been talking about, but there is also a lot of plans all the time to use it in different ways. And it's also, since we are talking about that it is this kind of place that has a loss of unified voice of what we are going to do with it. It has also in some parts become a kind of a dump. People are dumping waste there, and but it's also a perfect place for small dachas and things like that. So I mean, people behave in different ways in this area, and there is quite a lot, and we maybe are quite engaged in that is really crucial to keep these areas also as a nature reserve and a place which is quite high in diversity and has a kind of a wood that has not been harvested, and it has but it's really a diversity in also how people are using it and so on. So it is in a flux. It's hard to say. Or what do you say?
No, I think you said it very well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ylva, Mats. Thank you, Ivan. This was a great start of our webinar series. I'm so happy that you agreed to participate, and thank you to Sreda, Обучения, Arseni, and all of you who have joined in tonight. I hope to see you again next week when we have micro-territory Gorod Ustinov, as well as Fernando Garcia Dori, probably talking with us from Madrid. So I wish you all a wonderful evening and see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you.